whenever you spend, go shopping, spend, of course, it makes you happy. But social spending, I think, is something different. The reason it's different because it is extremely relevant, both for individuals and for countries. And therefore, it is also important for the stakeholders of international communities, including the fund and the bank and, of course, the others partners. So when I say social spending matters, why? Because we all know growth needs to be inclusive, and which basically means all citizens share the benefit or have a chance to share the benefit of economic growth. And that's all the social spending is about, which means that the social spending is related to pensions, social assistance, and of course public spendings on public health and education. So you can see that it is a core component of social contract to provide all citizens with a decent standard of living and the opportunities to participate fully in the society. Obviously, there are challenges to make social spending right. You can see in some countries, the growing numbers of the elderly people is putting pressures on pensions and healthcare systems. In other countries, of course, there are young populations which have the access to the quality educations, which is very important for these young populations. And also, the impact of technologies on wages and workers is also being felt across different groups of the groups in terms of the economies. And more broadly, there are many questions related to the future of work. So, you would not be surprised to see that when you seek the solutions could be very complex and sometimes will never be or hardly being tested. So, but what we know is that in designing effective social spending policies, to be sure, it is a complex undertaking. But we know that it requires a couple of the basic starting point, which, in my view, the first one is, of course, you need to tailor the social spending policies to country-specific circumstances, and you also need to recognize that the country face a capacity constraint, and also you need to recognize that to form a deep understanding of the policies, there are trade-offs involved. So sometimes it's hard trade-offs you have to make. What we also know is that social spending is one of the most important policy tools what we can have. But we should not view social spending as an afterthought. We need to think ahead. It belongs to the center of the many of our macroeconomic discussions. I have to go back a little bit what the fund has been doing in the past few, decades. Over the past decade, the IMF has been increasingly stepping up its engagement on issues related to inclusive growth and social spending. And this work pretty much related to our research and our capacity building work, as well as our policy advice to our member countries. And our aims of the social spending operations related to make the social spending policies more adequate, more efficient, and more physically sustainable. And of course, we need to do better. And this is why early this year, we launched a strategies for engagement on social spending. Of course, this is endorsed by all of the 189 member countries. To help with the strategies, we are collecting best practices from the past 2 decades of engagement by our country teams to strengthen the qualities and consistencies of our policy advice. Going forward, we will provide guidance to our teams as they implement the strategies in the areas of pensions, social assistance, health, and education, etc. Of course, another key pillar of the strategies is to work with our partners. This, of course, requires close elaborations and dialogues among all the stakeholders to raise the profiles of social spending issues in the broader discussions about economic policies. And the partnerships also include, the civil societies, academics, think tanks, international development institutions, and country officials. And of course, we very much hope all of them will come to the table to share their perspectives and resources. And we consider this is the partnership that recognized there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to designing social spending programs to each individual countries. But the purpose is try to, make it better to reduce the poverty, reduce inequalities, and protect households from economic adjustment and income shocks. And of course, in one word, we try to boost inclusion. So that's why we're here today. And I'm very much glad that we have all our partners gathering in this room and beyond this room, these buildings, and elsewhere online. In particular, of course, we have our distinguished panel speakers who will share with us their ideas and insight on how to move forward with social spending policies. I look forward to hearing your insightful input and discussions. So with that, I thank you once again, and I'd give the floor to Ali. Over you.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to Tao Zhang, Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Let's give him a hand. Thank you. Thank you for kicking off this session, helping countries strengthen social spending. Indeed, a very pertinent, very timely subject matter. Tao Zhang just named it. The IMF just launched a new strategy for IMF engagement on social spending just a few months ago. And we will pick up right there. We have a wonderful panel esteemed. Your input is very much wanted and desired. Social spending is the Twitter hashtag for this particular session, social spending. And I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all here, but also all those joining us live via the IMF webcast, ladies and gentlemen. And to my left, she's the Deputy Director General for Policy at the International Labour Organization. Please welcome Deborah Greenfield, ladies and gentlemen. Right next to her is a gentleman who knows this vicinity very well. He used to be a vice president of the World Bank. Currently, he is the Oxford University Professor of Globalization and Development. Ian Golding, ladies and gentlemen, is here. Delighted to have us a former member of the parliament in Uganda. Currently, she serves as the executive director of Oxfam International. Winnie Byanyima, ladies and gentlemen. And last but not least, a very experienced finance minister, politician. He used to serve as Australia's foreign minister from 2007 to 2013. Currently, he's the commissioner for the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. Wayne Swan, ladies and gentlemen, is here. Wayne, indeed, we just heard from Tao Jiang, spending. Spending is, of course, something that all countries would like to do, particularly when it comes to social spending. But of course, there's reality involved here and fiscal constraints that a lot of people have to deal with. From your experience as a former finance minister in the G20, how can countries finance an increase in social spending efficiently?
Well, the most important thing to do is to reform your tax systems so you have an adequate flow of revenue for the spending. But the problem that we've got globally at the moment is we've seen the destruction of progressive tax systems around the world, and that is increasingly crippling the capacity of countries around the world to spend on essential health, education and infrastructure. So essentially, the big task ahead, if we're going to get the resources to fund the social spending to make the SDGs a reality, is international tax reform at both the domestic and the international level. And until we get that, the SDGs are going to be nothing but a pipe dream.
What are the major obstacles, in your opinion and from your experience, when it comes to overhauling the international tax system?
Powerful vested interests. The truth is that too much money is evading tax and it's ending up in tax havens. So first and foremost, we've got to deal with the powerful vested interests that oppose progressive taxation and have dismantled it around the world. So the most important thing to get the resources through the tax revenue is to garner public support for progressive taxation. And perhaps more important than the design of the tax system is the importance of having that public support, which can take on the power of vested interests, so we can get back to a progressive tax system, because a progressive tax system lies at the heart of strong growth with equity. The truth is that the IMF, particularly, and a shout out here, has done fantastic work on inclusive growth. And what they show is that the fairer the distribution of resources in a society, the stronger the growth. And the more unequal societies become, the weaker the growth. So there's a roll gold economic argument to invest in the drivers of growth through investment in health and education, and to ensure that the living standards are lifted around the world by lifting the productivity and the competitiveness through tax reform. And that means progressive tax reform, not this race to the bottom in both rates and also tax to GDP ratios that we've seen particularly in my region in the Asia Pacific.
Reform of the international tax system, indispensable if one wants to increase social spending. Winnie, you are, of course, the executive director of Oxfam International, but you used to be a policymaker yourself. Would you concur with what Wayne just said?
Absolutely. Let me tell you a story of one woman in Cameroon called Alliance. Alliance was going to have a baby and needed a cesarean section. She went to the doctor and agreed for the money she had. The doctor said, a private doctor, that she could have only the delivery of the baby. That's all he could offer. She went in. The doctor forgot the placenta in her. So she got more and more ill. She stayed in the hospital. Her money ran out. The staff of the clinic threw her out because she couldn't pay more. Her family had to sell the piece of land that they had, their source of income, to save her life. Alliance in Cameroon. Today, 10,000 people will die because they can't access health care. It's unacceptable. Today, 242 million children will be denied being in a classroom because the governments can't afford to pay. Unacceptable. So behind these figures are stories of pain, of suffering, of death. We can't afford this. And the good news is that we can afford to put every child in school. We can afford to give everyone health care. Across the world, the examples of success from Thailand to Canada, to all rich and poor countries, those who have been successful through the expansion of public provision. So enough of the complacent thinking that there's no money, use the public money to leverage more private resources. Enough of the false solutions of private solutions that put profits before people, that put money going into the hands of companies before clinics and schools for children. Enough of that. We have good examples of public provision. In fact, the poor countries that are doing the best at fighting maternal mortality, 90% of that work is funded publicly. We found that. He's right, Wayne is right. If Oxfam has calculated that if you tax 1%, the top 1%, only 0.5% of their wealth, an additional 0.5% wealth tax on the top 1%, you'll put all the children in the world, the 242 million children in school, you'll save 3.3 million lives. So it's possible. We can tax progressively, we can stop tax dodging, and we can supplement these efforts with aid for those countries, the few countries that really can't tax, with aid. And we can solve the problem of inequality of health, inequality of education, and economic inequality.
And of course, we'll talk more later on about what role civil society organizations such as yours, Oxfam International, can play here in helping countries strengthen social spending. But I want to bring in Ian here. Ian, as I said, very experienced. You used to be a vice president across the street for the World Bank, now in the world of academia, looking at how globalization is playing out. So what is your recipe? What is your recipe? How do we help countries strengthen social spending?
I think there has been a fundamental failure to manage globalization, and it's not surprising we see the pushback politically. The financial crisis was the most obvious manifestation of that. The complete failure of experts, including, as has been admitted, this organization, but experts around the world, to understand complex systems and to manage them effectively, and also to understand the new technologies, credit derivatives and others. I don't think we would have the politics we have in the US today. I don't think we would have the politics of Brexit in the UK and much of the populism and nationalism without it. But it's also been a globalization which, as Wayne and Winnie have eloquently emphasized, that's been associated with a race to the bottom. The rules have been much too weak. The regulations have been much too weak, and so we have these spillovers of widening inequality, growing systemic risk, and of course a widening tragedy of the commons, of which climate change is one desperate, but certainly not the only manifestation. The oceans, many other failures of the commons. So I think the answer is that we need to, if we're going to enjoy the fruits of globalization, and of course we know the good news, the people that are anti-globalization are mainly in the advanced economies now. Asia is much happier with it. It's brought more benefits to more people more quickly than any process in history. I think the great danger is we throw the baby out with the bathwater. It needs to be managed effectively. It needs to be sustained, and it can only be sustained if global governance catches up with what's happening in systems, in economic systems, in technological systems, and elsewhere. And that, going back to what's been said, amongst the things that needs to happen is a stopping of the race to the bottom of taxation.
Does academia have a role to play here?
Academia always has a role to play.
But in particular, when it comes to social spending, pushing the countries, giving the right impetus.
I think what academia can do is stand back. We are not captured by short-term interests of politics. I think we have a capacity to look at the global experience. This is really an area where some countries are doing fantastically well, and some countries are doing absolutely terribly. There's a huge dispersion of experiences, of lessons learned, and if we can't learn those lessons, we really are wasting opportunities around the world. So one is to learn the opportunities. It was great to see yesterday or the day before that Esther Duflo, Mike Creamer, and Anjit Banerjee got the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work on randomized experiments. A major breakthrough in helping us understand, not least in this area of social welfare expenditures and social spending, how to do it effectively. So academia has an enormous amount to contribute. The problem is that one of the pushbacks against globalization is an anti-expert and an anti-evidence tendency, and we need to fight that, because if you don't want to rely on the evidence and the experts, you're in a much rougher world. We cannot extrapolate from the fact that experts let us down to the fact that experts can't contribute in the future. We need to get better.
Certainly you and both Tao Zhang have emphasized the role of the global financial crisis that have laid bare, if you will, the rampant inequalities all around the world. Deborah Greenfield, of course, the ILO, very much involved here in protecting the labor force worldwide. What is your contribution as an organization? When you talk to country representatives, how do you urge them on this particular subject matter?
Well, let me start by just talking about, making a simple point about the term social spending. At the ILO, we think of this as social investment. That is, this is a rights-based issue. People have the right to health care, they have the right to education, they have the right to social protection. And when we think of it as a right, then I think we come to different conclusions about what needs to be done. Because these rights anchor social and economic development in an inclusive and sustainable way. They are one of the key ways in which we drive a human-centered agenda and achieve the SDGs. Now, of course, we all know that in the future of work, there are many challenges that we face, and I don't need to list them to this audience. And so our policies do need to evolve to some extent. More importantly, I think they need to accelerate. The work that we do on the ground, in country, and as the Deputy Managing Director said, countries vary in what they need and how we will go about establishing universal social protection, which is what we're all about at the ILO. But we need to accelerate our programs, and we need to make sure that they are able to deal with some of the changes that we see, for example, some of the stresses on the employment relationship and new business models.
Mm-hmm. And let me bring in Wayne here again at some point. You said that looking around, of course, we know what needs to be done in terms of increased social spending. You've been around as a finance minister, looked at many models that other countries have been displaying. Now, as far as efficiency of social spending is concerned, what are some of the best practices that you have seen during your active time, but even now, and you are allowed to mention Australia?
Well, certainly. I mean, you absolutely need to have very strict control of your expenditure, and you need institutional mechanisms to ensure that that's verified. And that goes from the cabinet level all the way through to the public service and regular reviews of expenditure. So nothing is more destructive to putting in place a progressive tax system if expenditure is seen to be wasteful. So they're the same sides, the opposite sides of the same coin. That if you're going to argue for a progressive tax system, you've also got to be absolutely rigorous in your expenditure. And you cannot allow waste in the system, because that erodes public support for revenue raising, just as rampant tax evasion by either multinational companies or just the cash economy erodes support for the system overall. So there needs to be rigour in the system. But the real problem in the system, whether it is company income tax or whether it's personal income tax, is that they have become much more regressive in recent years. And that has been particularly bad in terms of its impact on the developing world, because they rely on corporate tax for a higher percentage of their revenues. So this current round, through the OECD, to try and renovate and fix up the international tax arrangements is absolutely critical to the future development of the Sustainable Development Goals in getting more revenue to health and education in particular. But it's even more broad than that, because we've got this trend now across the world to move or to push against progressive taxation, against profit-based taxation, to individualise the tax system through increased use of consumption taxes. And nothing could be more destructive to equality in the long run than an increased reliance on consumption taxes, which is why I've got to say that watching the debate last night, I was amused that one of the candidates has a solution to a fairer America, which is an increased consumption tax. like it's an oxymoron, increasing consumption taxes to make things fairer, then paying a whole lot of money to people who don't need any government grants and calling that progressive. There is actually a great system in place that was invented post-war. It's called the welfare state. It's built around progressive taxation, a decent social security system, which is means-tested, and a decent industrial relations system that gives people fair wages. That sounds pretty good to me.
At the end of the day, efficiency is key, though, you're saying,
Absolutely.
in order to gain and maintain the trust of the public.
If you look like you're going to spend like a drunken sailor, you won't get people signing up to a decent tax system. And if people are evading it and large companies are paying nothing, they won't sign up either.
Speaking of responsibility, obviously Oxfam International is doing fantastic work on the ground here. When a civil society organization do have a say, do have a stake in the social spending of countries, how do you, as an organization, how do you, as the executive director of Oxfam International, how are you operating here?
Well, I'm here really to give a voice, to ordinary people's voice, to the IMF. And I salute the IMF because we bring here a tough message, and then the next year they still invite us and we're here again. So this is the message to the IMF. We congratulate them on this report. Bringing social spending and highlighting its centrality to macroeconomic frameworks is very important. Their work on inequality, exploring the relationship between inequality and slowing sustainable long-term growth, and the effort to lift people from poverty is very important work. Our issue with the World Bank is that, with the IMF, is that after saying all that, we want them to move it to action, to the policy advice they give to governments. This is a weak link. And so here, while I'm on this panel, while congratulating the IMF on this paper on social spending, I want to ask the IMF to do no harm in countries. When they are called in, and in times of austerity, we want to see them protect the social spending that is existing. And they do in many cases. But actually, even when they say don't cut, we see that they cut. The governments go ahead to cut. So they must do more to protect social spending in times of austerity. That's important. Two, what Wayne has said, they need to get to support governments to tax progressively. They are still giving governments advice to apply VAT, regressive taxation. They're still even putting it in loan conditionalities. That's wrong. They should help governments, support governments to tax the rich and raise more revenue, and also to get behind the global corporate tax agenda. The BEPS is leading well. BEPS 2.0 is a good process. We have supported it. We have pushed it to be a more inclusive process. It's more inclusive, but we need to get the IMF behind this too, leading a global corporate tax reform that will block the ways of tax dodging and increase revenues for social spending. And lastly, I think the IMF can play a more important role in pushing the donors on the question of aid. Aid has plateaued, and aid has been diverted for other purposes other than fighting poverty. We need to get the IMF to be tougher and speak with a more forceful voice to the rich governments to stand, to uphold their responsibility to help the poorest countries to lift themselves from poverty through social spending, through social protection. So yes, it's possible. Governments can raise more revenue. It's possible governments can do that through taxation and ending tax dodging, but we also still need the lift up by some rich countries for those countries emerging from crisis.
And the IMF is well represented here in the room, and surely your message has been heard loud and clear. They've taken notice as to what steps need to be taken from here on. Ian, you mentioned there are some countries who do very well on this front, some less so. Who are those who do well? What are some of the best practices you've seen?
Take a country like Ethiopia.
The question was actually to Ian, but please go ahead. If you,
Sorry.
but I can see you're already in the mix. And perhaps we give Ian a chance to respond, and I'll bring you in back, Winnie. Ian.
Yeah, I mean, what's remarkable is the different part of government expenditure that's devoted to social expenditures and the different amount that government expenditure is of total GDP. And this varies enormously widely. You have countries like Denmark and France where it's over 50%, and you have other countries, including many Latin American countries, where it's like 5-10%. Now, it's not surprising if your revenue is such a small part of your economy that you can't do much. The difference between before and after tax expenditures to inequality and to welfare are enormously varied. In the US, it's maybe 5% or maximum 10% of a change that the government makes to people's lives, whereas in France and Denmark, again, you can have 30, 40, 50% change in your outcome. That is the difference between living on the streets, which you see outside here in Washington, and having somewhere to live, or your child being born in a hospital or not. That's the difference. Obviously, in the poorer the country, the less resources they have, but the same basic questions apply. Is government taxing, and is it redistributing, or is it not?
Very much echoing what Tao Zhang said, there's no one size fits all, and obviously there are changes as far as policy responses are concerned when it comes to advances versus developing countries. Winnie, very quickly, before I bring in Deborah, name us the good examples, the best practices that you were about to mention.
Ethiopia, with a very poor country, has brought more than 10 million children into school by expanding education for all children. This is in spite of being one of the poorest countries in the world. The same on health. Thailand. You know, what people don't know is that Thailand expanded universal health care at a time when its GDP was the same as that of this great country in 1930. But it was able to roll out, and 80% of their health care is publicly provided. And how? Through progressive taxation. They tax the rich, they raise the money, and they give everyone universal, free, quality health care. So, and now everybody, even in the UN, goes for health tourism to Thailand, because they've been so successful, they're even able to sell it and raise more revenue to pay for public service. So it's possible. It's possible. Those are just two examples.
Thank you so much. Deborah, we talked a lot about the role of governments, obviously here, also the role of the IMF. We haven't talked much about the private sector here. How can we involve the private sector in helping to strengthen social spending systems?
I think this is related to one of the key ingredients of financing in the view of the ILO. Of course, we agree totally with the need, the urgent need for progressive taxation. But we don't think that in many countries there is enough revenue, there's not a large enough revenue base to finance a robust and universal social protection system solely through taxes, which is why we continue to stress that another key ingredient of financing social protection systems and establishing the floors that give everyone the right to access social protection when they need it is through social insurance, that is, contributions made by employers and by workers. Now, that does carve out a key role for the private sector. It does some other things. First, it achieves a kind of horizontal redistribution from the healthy to the sick, from the young to the poor. It allows, from the young to an aging population, it provides the means to access your right to social protection when you need it. Now, there's been a lot of criticism that the employment relationship is changing so much that we can't rely on social insurance, on contributory social insurance, for building social protection floors and then for increasing the floors as a second step. We actually don't think that is the case. Again, every country is different. However, the employment relationship, while it's changing, is still very much there. You can be a part-time worker, you can be a temporary worker, but you have an employer. And so while it is the case that we see less and less of the standard employment relationship over time, we do have employers and workers who should be shouldering their contribution to a social protection system. Second, we're all tremendously concerned about informality. 60% of the world is in the informal economy. In some countries, it's 90%. But we can't say that nobody in the informal economy is capable of contributing to a social insurance system. In fact, many workers in the informal economy can. Those who can't should be helped through social assistance, through taxation. But by allowing and facilitating workers in the informal economy to make their contributions, we start bringing them into the formal economy, which is an incredibly important aspect of social inclusion, of economic inclusion, and of the kind of development we want to see. One more thing about the private sector. At the ILO, our solutions are tripartite. That is, we work with employers, we work with workers, and we work with governments to come up with solutions. The private sector plays a key role in developing enduring and sustainable solutions that everyone buys into. And in that sense, the private sector is also very important.
We're about to go into the audience. Winnie, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I know you wanted to respond directly to what Deborah said. I want to give you the opportunity, and then we'll go straight into the Q&A with the audience. Go right ahead.
I just want to put a little caution on this private sector provision. These inequitable health insurance schemes worry me because the people who need health care include the most vulnerable people, include those who are on the margins of society, people living with HIV/AIDS. These are often people who are rejected by society. They are not going to get a health package that has a private sector profit motive that will work for them. So I have some caution there. Also, targeted social protection, our own research in civil society shows that it doesn't work. You need to provide social protection universally. When you target it, you lose so many people. You lose girls, you lose poor people, you lose gay people, you lose so many people whom society puts on the margins.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's become very evident and abundantly clear we have a lot of expertise here in the audience when it comes to this topic, but I'm sure and I know we have a lot of expertise in the audience as well, expertise I would like to make use of. We have approximately 12, 13 minutes left, so I would ask you to be short. If you have questions, there are microphones on both sides of the aisle. Apparently people are still digesting what we gave them as far as information. So go up. I'll see you if you go up. I'll bring you in. Wayne, until that happens, what is the one message that you would like the audience, both in here and those watching us all, to take away on this particular subject matter?
Well, I think the distributional implications of decisions are critical. We spent 30-odd years ignoring distributional implications, and it's just very clear we do that at our peril. So the rampant wealth and income inequality that we're experiencing is now having political ramifications around the world. So the reconstruction of our public policy, but particularly progressive tax, is absolutely urgent. But it can only happen if countries are able to develop a tax culture. And at the moment, those people who are opposed to progressive tax systems will always argue that, that they repress or suppress aspiration. My submission is that aspiration is only possible where people are lifted up by fundamental investment in health and education as well as the hard areas of the economy, such as infrastructure, and that an effective collaboration between the public and private sector, based upon a decent level of revenue delivered principally through tax, is a growth model, and a much more sustainable growth model than we've experienced for the last 30 years.
All right, thank you, Wayne. We have one. Please go right ahead. Please introduce yourself quickly.
Thank you. My name is Maura Francese. I work here at the IMF. So my question is, how could countries better face the challenge of increased mobility across jurisdictions, across jobs? How could they strengthen their social spending to actually face and tackle this challenge?
All right, thank you so much. We're going to collect the questions and then throw it back to the panel. So please take notes. Go right ahead, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Grace Po from the Philippines. I'm not a tax expert, but I'm a consumer, and you mentioned that consumer taxes are not a progressive way or a solution to be able to raise funds. So what would be a progressive way of taxing? Thank you.
Thank you so much. What will be I'm sure Wayne has a thing or two to say about that. Go right ahead, ma'am.
Thank you very much. My name is Rosemary Mseminali. I work for UNAIDS as External and Donor Relations Director. Yesterday we listened to the Director General, Madame Kristalina, and she was talking about unpaid labor, especially done by women. And we know that much of what is not able to be spent in terms of social spending in the communities is shouldered by women especially, looking after those who have been discharged from hospitals prematurely and nursing them endlessly, those who have mental problems and so on. And even those who are not educated, the women remain home and teach them and educate them. So what does the IMF have in plan to try and bridge that gap between the lack of the social spending and the work that is done by unpaid care? Do we have a way of making sure that that unpaid care is boosted and calculated and counted within the GDPs, and how can they be facilitated to do better and lessen their burden?
Right, thank you so much. Of course, we have no one from the IMF actually on the panel, but I'm sure Deborah will be happy to tackle this one in particular. Go right ahead.
My question can also be tackled by the panelists.
And it will. Don't worry about it. We have someone from the ILO here who certainly has a thing or two to say about that. Ma'am, go right ahead. The last three questions.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Yester. I am the Chief of Social Policy for Unicef. I'm grateful to all the panelists for the comments so far, and I'd like to hear your advice to the IMF on how to factor climate change into social spending. Where do we need to take account of the long-term impacts of climate change on all of us, and especially on the children of this world, as we think forward for fiscal sustainability for social spending?
Thank you so much. Very timely question indeed. Gentlemen.
Thank you. My name is Barry Herman, and on Friday I'm on a panel that maybe can take this discussion a little bit further. I'm concerned that we have all the arguments, but we don't have the way to make it happen politically. And so we will have a discussion on how to change the IMF's austerity policy and prevent cuts in social protection floors during crises. That's after the IMF's own briefing on its new social spending policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last question, please go ahead.
My name is Martin Klein from Germany. I'm heading the government practice of a technology company. We know that the willingness to pay taxes is very much dependent on also the trust in government, and we know that trust in government is at an all-time low these days across the globe. My question is, what do you see as best practices of sharing transparency by governments to increase the willingness and the trust levels to pay taxes?
Thank you so much. A lot of questions to our distinguished panelists. Very much looking forward to the answers. Ian, why don't you kick it off?
Okay, let me just pick up three questions briefly. Mobility. It's a key point, both for within countries and between countries, how one transfers rights, pension rights, contributions of social security and others. There's actually a decline in mobility within countries, not least in the advanced economies. Within the US, there's a dramatic decline. Within Europe, there's a dramatic decline between places. And one of the ways to understand rising inequality within countries is this failure of people to be able to move to where the jobs are. That's related in part to this question of social spending. When you ask people in the Midwest of the US why they don't go to the coastal cities where they're dynamic economies, the answers are about housing markets and care. They can't leave their elderly dependents, they can't find social security, they can't get kids into school, those sorts of social expenditure questions. So increasing flexibility is vital. Another impact of globalization is that the world is changing more fast because there's more and more ideas, but that means people are getting left behind quicker. We should expect rising inequality as a dynamic thing coming out of globalization, unless it's countered. That's the force, and mobility is absolutely key to it. The same thing with, of course, movement between countries. Let me touch this question of unpaid labor. I think it's also key. One of the reasons why we need a radical rethink of the future of work is, of course, that AI will replace anything that's rules-based and replicated. A lot of repetitive tasks will be let go. Our estimate from our group in Oxford is 47% of jobs in the US, about 40% in Europe, and a much higher share in Africa. When you ask the question, what is the future of work? The answer has to be, a big part of that is paying people for things that aren't currently paid for. Care work, homework, and other work, and thinking much more about creative industries and others that machines will not do, that also needs to be paid for. So rethinking this whole contract, and I think the IMF has a key role to play in this, rethinking the idea of work, and clearly the ILO does, and how you pay and reward and how you tax is vital. The final point I'd like to pick up is on climate change. This is part of the broader constellation of failure. One of the reasons we need more active governments going forward, and part of more active governments means more tax, of course credible tax, is because there's going to be much more shocking things happening in our systems. Shocks from climate change, shocks from other sources like pandemics and others. In a hyper-integrated system, there's more surprise, more shock, and it's always the poorest and the most vulnerable that suffer most. The only way to stop that increasing inequality and leading to desperate poverty is through increased social expenditure and a stronger safety net, as well as mobility within countries. And I think climate change is going to highlight that dramatically, particularly for places which are just going to be underwater, like Mumbai, like Dakar, like so many other places. We're predicting well over 1 meter ocean rise this century and many more storm surges. Where are these people going to go and how they're going to survive is absolutely key to this question we're addressing today.
Thank you, Ian, for answering some of the questions that were addressed. Winnie, Deborah, and then we'll finish with Wayne.
Yes, quickly agreeing on the question of unpaid care work, that as a feminist, I see that women, the work that women do, that women and the environment have been treated in this global economy in the same way, as a resource that is elastic, that you can stretch and use and you don't have to pay for. Really trashed. Because when you think about all the work that women do in homes and in communities, it's a contribution to the paid economy, but it is not paid. And now we have come to question the role of the environment, the cost of the environment in the economy. We are paying the price through climate change. We need to rethink also the roles of women, the unpaid work that women do, and recast it and create opportunity through it to grow a fairer economy. So I totally agree about the redefinition of work and the compensating carers fairly in the economy. Two, on climate change, you raise an important point. In many countries now, you can see the differential impact, gendered impact of climate change, that it's creating more and more work, more and more difficulty, particularly for women and girls in many of the poor countries, walking longer distances to look for water, to look for energy, domestic fuel. You see that the crisis of homes that are destroyed, reconstructing them, the burdens on men and women are shifting. and on girls and boys. It's important to look at that and facilitate that. For very poor countries, particularly like Africa, where now debt has mounted and many countries have reached levels of debt and sustainability, while at the same time they are facing droughts and floods and disasters, we need to see how those countries are going to be supported to be able to manage in those contexts. To see a country like Mozambique being pushed through the back doors to austerity, instead of saying, look, let's see how do we restructure this debt because you've just been hit by a disaster. I think that is a moral outrage. So we need to look at climate change in the context of these very poor countries that are indebted and give relief to them.
Thank you so much. Deborah.
Thank you. So let me address briefly the question of unpaid labor. At the ILO, our research shows that gender equality begins at home. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the disproportionate share of domestic work, of care work around the world, whether you're talking about the most advanced economies or developing economies, falls on women and girls. And so unless we tackle that, we'll never achieve gender equality, at least gender equality in the workplace, which of course costs us trillions of dollars a year. So what we need is to develop a care economy that is characterized by decent work. That is, people who are paid well with decent working conditions to take care of the elderly, of children, of people who are sick. And of course, this also strengthens our opportunities to create universal social protection, including social protection floors. We need maternity and paternity policies across the board that really incentivize a more equitable sharing of the work. And then we also need measures to complement, not to replace, but to complement GDP, so that we can begin to actually measure the contribution of unpaid work. The International Conference of Labor Statisticians, which meets periodically about every 3 years, is now defining work to include unpaid work so that we can understand, we have the evidence base for making the case for the contribution of unpaid work. Briefly about climate change. Our members promote a just transition for workers and enterprises who are to a more carbon neutral economy. Of course, this requires that we have policies that create an enabling environment for the transition for employers, as well as creating decent jobs for workers who cannot continue to do what they're doing if we're going to achieve our climate goals. Again, this would be characterized by universal social protection. Finally, there was a question about how to accomplish this politically. There is an enormous call right now to the international organizations, to the IFIs, to achieve greater policy coherence. Now, this is a long-term project, but we need to start defining what our common principles are. How do we finance social protection through a combination of taxation as well as contributions, which are not private insurance schemes, but are contributions that then allow people to draw on what they've contributed through a government scheme. And of course, taxation must support those who can't do that. But we need to start defining where we agree so that at country level, we're not providing conflicting advice to the countries that need our help the most.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And last but certainly not least, Wayne, I heard a couple of questions certainly that are going to pertain to your interest, progressive taxing, certainly one of them, and the question from the gentleman from Germany about the correlation between trust and tax. Go right ahead.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the consumption tax, because we'll always have consumption taxes. Any tax system will have a part reliance on consumption taxes, as it must, and that's particularly the case for many economies that are not very well developed. The most important thing to do is that over time, make your system as progressive as you can, to ensure that you reward labour when labour works hard, and to be sure that you, for the long term, incentivise capital. But at the moment, so many of the incentives in the system are all wrong, which is why we've got rampant inequality. So consumption taxes will be part of the solution. But what we've seen in recent times is a push by the flat taxes away from the profit-based taxes, which actually deliver the rents back to the people, onto consumption taxes, which then drives higher inequality. Secondly, on climate change, it is entirely possible to have judicious social spending to achieve your carbon reduction outcomes. And I would say there's a perfect example here of what was introduced in Australia in 2011. A carbon price backed up by essential social spending, particularly to protect the living standards of those that were most vulnerable and in the middle, and then backed up by a very big package of investment in renewable energy. And it was a very good package, but the political argument was lost. Which brings me to the third point, trust. Trust in government is at the core of what those who want a flatter tax system seek to destroy. We just have to be realistic that this is a matter of political economy. And for 30 years, we've faced a consensus that has argued that tax is bad, smaller government is good, and all governments exist to do is to cut taxes and to suppress wages. So this is the political argument that has not been won, but it must be won. There is so much common sense in the observation that if you pay tax, you buy civilisation. And progressives have not been very good at making those arguments. And that is particularly true here in the United States. And partially that reflects the ascendancy of Donald Trump and others elsewhere. For those on my side of politics, we have to do so much better than we have done over the last 10 or 20 years to mount the arguments that were successfully prosecuted and put in place post-war. That is, we built a welfare state as a hedge against fascism on the right and communism on the left. But somewhere in the last 30 years that has been destroyed. And we have to, those of us who have the view that progressive taxation is not only the way ahead in terms of society, it's the way ahead for a much more prosperous and strongly growing economy. We have to be much better at making these arguments, and that's all political.
And those arguments were being made here, certainly on stage today, ladies and gentlemen. Helping countries strengthen social spending. This has been the discussion we've had here for the past 60 minutes. I think I speak for all when I say this has been extremely content-rich debate. We heard from former finance minister, civil international organization, academia, and of course, all across the pond. Thank you to the IMF for putting this topic on the agenda, for placing this panel here within the annual meeting. Certainly a topic that will engage us for many, many more years to come, as inequality, I think we have, this has been made abundantly clear, is one of the most pressing and urgent subject matters of our time. Deborah Greenfield, Ian Golding, Winner Byanyima, and Wayne Swan, this is your applause. Thank you so much. Okay.